Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Gates. I'm Syria's event manager. Before I hand over to Abigail, who is our chair today, I'm just going to let you know how you can submit questions to today's presenters. You'll see that there is a questions box at any point in any of the presentations. If you have a question for any of today's presenters, if you could please type your question into the questions box, and also if you could let us know who you're directing that question to, and we'll run through all the questions we've received at the end of the webinar. I should also say thank you for your understanding in switching to a webinar today. The flip side, the positive to take from it, is that it has allowed some colleagues to join who are not Southeast based, so that's great. And we'll look forward to today's presentations. So yeah, just a reminder, if you can please submit your questions through the questions box, and we'll look forward to going through those at the end of the presentations. Okay, Abigail, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Will. Good afternoon, everyone. As Will said, my name's Abby Bryant, Director of Consultancy at Wessex Archaeology, and I'm delighted to be chairing the webinar today. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers, who are each of them some of the preeminent practitioners in our field. Next year, it'll be 30 years since the advent of PPG 16 and the birth of what we've come to understand as commercial archaeology. And I think at the time, in 1990, few people could have imagined that by 2019, it would have developed into a £250 million a year sector, employing the best part of 5,000 people directly through applied archaeology companies and thousands more through multidisciplinary construction and engineering consultancies and the public sector and beyond. As an organisation, I feel Syria have kind of long since recognised the intrinsic relationship between archaeology and the construction industry. And indeed, the 2008 guide remains one of the most detailed and forward-thinking documents on the subject. The 2008 guide was one of the first documents, in my view, of its kind to clearly articulate the application of risk management, which is a concept well understood in the construction industry, to the subject of archaeology, and also to actively promote the real and tangible benefit that proper engagement with the resource can deliver to projects. So to that end, the proposed updates to the guidance that Syria are proposing are focused primarily on bringing it in line with current planning policy, and re-emphasising the process and the value of early engagement and the roles of the various individuals in that process, and signalling the value of new and emerging technologies and techniques. So today, we're going to hear from some industry experts, some of whom may just remember the pre-PPG 16 days, but all of whom are definitely engaged in delivering modern archaeological input into some of the most complex and large-scale development projects of recent years. First of all, we're going to hear from Jenny Wiley, Associate Technical Director at Arcadis. Using the development of Otterpool Park Garden Settlement in Kent as a case study, Jenny will explain the ways in which archaeology has been used to deliver value to that ambitious project. Next, I had planned to say that no seminar about archaeology in the modern day would be complete without mention of HS2, but unfortunately, Dr. John Halstead, the Historic Environment Research and Delivery Strategy Manager at HS2 Limited, is unwell and is not able to talk to us about the application of the HERD strategy. I understand from Will that there may be some possibility for his presentation or some notes to be circulated at a later date, so hopefully that can be done. So instead of railways, we'll then move on to roads. Russell Coleman, Commercial Director at Headland Archaeology, will take us through some of the challenges, key learnings and innovations from the A14 Cambridge to Huntington Improvement Scheme, delivered in partnership with Mola. And last but by no means least, we have Ed Wilson, Lead Archaeologist in Specialist Services at the Environment Agency, talking about the fascinating world of coastal realignment projects, which is a subject very close to my heart, and the benefits of close heritage collaboration. So, as long as the technology works, Jenny, I think it's over to you for your talk.
Thanks, Abigail. Just bear with me while we hand over to Jenny. Hi, Jenny. You should now have control of the webinar.
Hi. Many thanks, Abby. I will start with a brief apology. Obviously, because I was going to be presenting today, I have developed a bit of a sore throat and a cough, so I'll apologise in advance for any croaky voice and slight coughing that happens through my talk. So as Abby mentioned, for this session, I'm going to present a case study that demonstrates how the process of archaeological assessment and investigation can add value to a development project, and how early consideration of archaeology through master planning and the planning submission process can allow for better management of cost and programme during construction. So, and as Abby mentioned, the case study I'm going to present is Otterpool Park. So just a brief bit of context. Otterpool Park is a proposed new garden settlement in East Kent. The master plan site is 580 hectares and located to the west of Folkestone, and to the northern boundary of the site is the M20 motorway and the high-speed one, or as it used to be known, CTRL railway line. The development will be an 8,500 home new settlement with associated commercial, retail, educational and public use facilities, and there is an option for an additional extension of the development for a further 1,500 homes, which takes us to 10,000 homes, which I believe is the criteria for a new town. So our client on the project is Folkestone and Hythe Council, alongside Cozumel Estates. And the reason for bringing the project forward is to meet the housing quota to 2037. Folkestone and Hythe intend to meet this quota by building a new town rather than adding to existing towns within their area. The key aims of the project are to create a landmark garden town with heritage as a key contributor. The town will have garden city principles combining the best of rural and urban living, and should be landscape led and have a large proportion of green space. So much of the work that we've been doing has been really focused on helping the client achieve those key aims. So this is where we were in the beginning, when we just had started to take our initial assessments of the site. When we began our work back in early 2016, I think it was clear that there was a range of known and unknown archaeology within the site. There were some obvious archaeological constraints, such as the scheduled castle on the northern boundary of the site, the smatter of listed buildings within the site, which are shown, hopefully they're reasonably visible as the red dots. And those listed buildings also included the site of Otterpool Manor, which is circled in yellow in the centre of the image you can see on your screen. We had Stone Street Roman Road running along through the northeastern corner and along the eastern boundary of the site. And then we had various military archaeology features associated with Lymm Airfield, which is the blue circled area at the southern end of the site. These military features included various upstanding pillboxes and a Picket Hamilton fort. And the site also had large areas of undeveloped agricultural land where almost nothing was known of the archaeological potential. And you can see those circled in green in various locations around the site. Just to the south of Western Hanger Castle, we have Folkestone Racecourse, which at the time of us starting the work on the site was already derelict. And finally, we had groups of heritage assets just outside the boundary of the site, including a couple of registered park and gardens, a conservation area, more listed buildings, and more scheduled monuments. So at the early stages of the project, one of our key aims was reduce the risk of the project from the archaeological resource. But we also knew that the archaeological resource at this site had huge potential to add value to the project. From the outset, we knew that archaeology was going to be a major part of the master planning and design of the site and would be a key topic in the planning application. The development was going to interact with some nationally significant heritage assets, such as the castle, and we also knew that there was a lot of potential for large amounts of as yet undiscovered archaeology to be present. All of these factors meant that there were both risks and opportunities from archaeology on this project, which presented both constraints to development, but also opportunities to add value to the project. Some of the key risks and opportunities could be dealt with through design. However, the unknown archaeological potential could have posed a significant risk during the construction phase due to the potential lack of clarity around cost and programme that dealing with unknown quantities of archaeology can present. So as you can see from this slide, I've just pulled out some of the key risks and opportunities that we were talking about at the initial stages of the assessment. Many of them obviously associated around the castle, but we also had design risk associated with Lymm airfield and how much of the airfield would be available for development. We had a UXO risk there, significant amounts of unexploded ordnance in the area. Folkestone Racecourse, there was much discussion around was it even a heritage asset or was it modern disturbance? There were differences of opinions. Obviously the unknown archaeology that I have mentioned. And then the opportunities. Western Hangar created a great opportunity in terms of having a focal point for the development, creating a sense of place and really turning the castle into a community asset. Lymm airfield had equal opportunity to contribute to placemaking and creating a sense of local history. There's a huge amount of public interest in the local area in the airfield and the surviving World War II features within the area. And then we also knew we had this great opportunity to reduce cost and programme risks by increasing understanding of the archaeological potential. Because we had early involvement in the project and we had identified the potential costs and programme risks at an early stage to the client, we were able to work with our client to implement a programme of archaeological assessment and investigations to increase our knowledge of the archaeological resource within the site. And we were able to then use this approach to add value in the later stage of the project. And this approach isn't new, it isn't bespoke, it is following the principles set out in planning policy, starting with PPG 16 through the PPS 5 and now into the MPPF. The project is ongoing and we are still conducting the archaeological investigations, but to date we've completed a comprehensive suite of desk-based assessment work, cartographic aerial photograph and LiDAR analysis, site walkover, archaeological monitoring of GI works, around 300 hectares of geophysical survey, and to date 61 hectares of archaeological trial trenches. And all of this work combined has significantly increased our understanding of the site. So this image shows the interpretation of the geophysics results. The areas shaded in green are areas that have been covered with geophysical survey at the time of production of this slide. There are some small areas that have been done since then, but no significant difference. So as you can see, those areas of undeveloped agricultural land that I drew your attention to on an earlier slide are now full of archaeological features. So following on for the geophysics, we are now running a programme of archaeological trial trenching. So the areas hatched in green are areas that have been covered to date. We started the trenching programme with high priority areas. So these are areas that we have identified through the desk-based work, APs, LiDARs, geophysics, etc., as having highest potential for significant concentrations of archaeology, or archaeology that is likely to have high significance. But we also focused on trenches where construction activity would be most intense, so areas where we knew there was dense housing proposed, for example. And what have we found from the investigation so far? Well, we found that the site was a rich historic landscape containing previously not known about archaeological remains. We have Mesolithic and Neolithic remains, including a possible causewayed enclosure. We have Bronze Age field systems. We have an early to mid Bronze Age barrow cemetery. We have early to late Iron Age enclosures and pits. We have a late Iron Age and Roman field systems. We have a Roman villa with hypercaust trackways, a possible malting oven, and evidence of glass furnacing. We have Roman farmsteads. We have part of the formal Tudor gardens to the castle. And we have found a large number of landscape features associated with the castle, including the former deer park, and we were actually able to trace the line of the park pale through historic mapping and LiDAR. So at this point, I just want to briefly touch on one of the feature types we've identified through our assessment work, the prehistoric barrows. So at the beginning of the project, we knew that there was one or possibly two barrows within the site. However, through the various assessment and investigation works we've conducted, we've identified a large number of other barrows. This has significantly added to the understanding of the distribution of prehistoric funerary monuments in this part of Kent, but has also created potential further constraints for the Otterpool project. So a key focus of our work in relation to these particular archaeological features was to understand the preservation and significance of each barrow, so we could identify which ones needed to be preserved in situ and which ones could be mitigated by record. So what have we done with all this information that we've been collating? So one of the ways we have added value to the project is by managing constraint through design. Here you can see some of the ways that this has been done. The most significant of the prehistoric barrows have been preserved in situ. We have maintained areas of open space around Otterpool Manor, which contains a small cluster of listed buildings and is also a former medieval settlement. We have retained some of the key airfield features, such as the Pickett Hamilton Fort and the pillboxes. We've placed areas of open space in the location of the villa, so we can preserve that in situ. The line of Stone Street Roman Road has been preserved and a new high street constructed to the west to divert traffic away from the line of the Roman road. And we have incorporated a park into the master plan located just to the south of the castle, and more about that in the second. So understanding of this design mitigation and the drivers for it as the project moves forward into the construction phase will be important, as it may have implications for construction techniques in the preservation in situ areas. One of the key topics that has featured through the life of the Otterpool Park project is Western Hanger Castle. Impacts from the development on the castle and risks to the project from the castle have been the focus of many discussions, and we've produced a number of detailed assessments focusing on understanding the significance of this asset and managing the risk in both directions, both to and from the project. One key piece of design that has come out of our assessment sprang from the work we did on defining the setting of the castle and identifying previously lost features. The area to the south of the castle, which has been agricultural land since the post-medieval period and then latterly occupied by Folkestone Racecourse, was identified through our work as being part of the former deer park associated with the castle. Our assessments were able to identify the former Park Pale, as I've previously mentioned, and also the lost formal Tudor gardens, which are located immediately to the south of the castle buildings. And we also rediscovered the southern access track to the castle. Working with the design team, we've incorporated these features into the master plan. The area to the south of the castle will become a public park. There will be a new formal garden in the location of the Tudor Gardens, and the southern access track will be reinstated, which will reintroduce the original formal access to the castle. This feature will not only serve to enhance the setting of the castle, but also adds value to the development by increasing the desirability of the area. Once again, understanding the drivers behind the design in this location will be important during construction, so appropriate measures can be put in place around these sensitive assets. So this project has shown what a rich landscape the Otterpool site is, with a long history of human activity, covers a large area and already has several distinct heritage identities within it. And through our work, we are working to reference that and to create a place that doesn't just feel dropped into the landscape, but references the past in a way that people can appreciate and engage with. I've talked about the park by the castle, which will be a town park. There will be a new high street and town centres near the station, which are going to form part of one of several distinct neighbourhoods. Because the site will be built out in phases over 30 years, each neighbourhood needs to have its own distinct identity but still be interconnected. Master planners also wanted to create an interesting place for visitors as well as residents, and one of the ways this has been done is with a heritage trail, which is what you can see here. The aim of the heritage trail is to make the countryside and the heritage within it more accessible, with links through the development to outside. And you can see from the image on this slide how many of the heritage assets that we identified through our assessment work have been incorporated into this heritage trail. The project has also been working in consulting with and involving airfield groups and parish councils, who also have considerable interest in the heritage and archaeology of this area. And through this, the project is aiming to increase a sense of community buy-in, and it's also adding value for the client, who is also a regional policymaker, as they're keen to invest in heritage and hope that the heritage of Otterpool Park will be well developed for the people who will live there. So hopefully what I have demonstrated with this case study is the benefits of early assessment and investigation on a project. As I mentioned, we've been working on this project since 2016. We're currently in the stage of simultaneously submitting a planning application and continuing the archaeological trial trench evaluation. Because of this early assessment investigation, we have been able to identify the most significant archaeology so it can be preserved in situ and incorporated into the design. We have achieved good clarity on the archaeological potential of the site, which means a clear mitigation strategy can be produced and used when letting construction contracts, hopefully fewer surprises at construction stage. We have greater clarity on cost of the archaeological mitigation that's going to be required, and that gives us increased control over the programme as well. The archaeology is making a positive contribution to the master plan, creating a sense of place and community buy-in, and that increased understanding of the archaeological resource has led to more enhancement opportunities for the development, such as the formal gardens and the heritage trail. So that's all from me. If you are particularly interested in the project, do feel free to go to otterpoolpark.org and have a look at the information on the heritage of the site that's included there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and you did a really good job of battling your sore throat there as well. I'm just going to hand over to Russell Coleman now, so please bear with me. Right, Russell, you should be able to show us your screen. That's great, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I know Jenny was suffering from a cough there. I'm in a room with no windows and it's extremely hot in here. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to talk about the A14, Cambridge to Huntingdon Improvement Scheme. A huge, probably one of the biggest projects in recent years, may yet be overtaken by HS2, but certainly it was a big project, and so much to learn on it. Okay, so this is really what I was going to talk about. This is our brief from Syria today, so perhaps a bit of an introduction, a look at some of the good practice that we did along on the project, and a bit of a look at some of the technology and innovation, some added value, lessons learnt, and a look at the benefits of early involvement. Just to say who we are, it was the project was really run by Muller Headland Infrastructure. That's Muller from Museum of London and Headland Archaeology. The project grew so big that actually even that wasn't enough, and probably about halfway through we started working with COPA, which is Cotswold, Oxford and PCA, and also Albion, and also an Italian university who we had links with. There's a quick look at the road. I've not got no maps today, but yeah, if you know Cambridge to Huntingdon, this is the actual road. Very flat landscape, very wet. Now, one of our managers who probably had a bit of time in his hands worked out that actually we actually excavated the equivalent of 7 Vatican cities. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the scale of this project. I'm not going to go into detail on what we actually found. I'm going to concentrate more on the learnings, but we had everything. This was actually quite unusual. We don't usually pick up Paleolithic stuff, but we did on this. So there was a lot about, in fact, it was on the news quite a lot about woolly rhinoceroses and woolly mammoths. We had everything from that. Lots of henges, lots of barrows, as you'd probably expect. Lots of Roman and Iron Age, dozens and dozens of sites like this, with some Iron Age, some Roman, some both. Probably the biggest unexpected discovery in terms of what we actually found was the Saxon settlements. We found 2 or 3 Saxon settlements and a medieval deserted village, which didn't show up really in any geophysics or any trenching. So that was the biggest surprise, I think, of the whole lot. Just to give you an idea of the scale, we investigated about 800 hectares in terms of geophysics and child trenching, and actually ended up with about 28% of that. 228 hectares eventually is what we actually fully excavated. And you can see the scale of that, 65,000 person days, almost 5 years of watching machines. And I'll just move this, can't quite see my own slide there. Yeah, we had about 40 sites in total. And on average, we had about 12 sites running at any one time, but at its peak, we had 17 sites running in parallel. Again, on average, we probably had about 150 on site, but at its peak, 250 we had at one point, and with another 50 off site. So we actually had about 300 staff on the project. The largest single team on one site, we actually had one site with 136 staff on it. And one of those sites ran for 83 weeks. So you can see the scale of the exercise. In terms of data, I mean, these projects are massive on data. It's a real matter for projects like this to be managing that. 92,000 contacts, 1,600 plans, 15,000 sections, so you get a feel for how much data we're actually generating and producing. And the one at the bottom is another one just to pick out there. 17,000 buckets of environmental samples, which we'll come on to later. And you can probably guess from all that as well as the archaeology projects like this are really heavy on admin and logistics, so there's almost as much to do in that as the archaeology. So yeah, we need a big team of admin. Fleets and fleets of vehicles and drivers is a real issue on linear schemes. There's so many young people don't drive now, but finding drivers is a major headache. And obviously we had premises, and we had to churn through 17,000 buckets of samples to feed back to the teams. So we actually set up on site. This was actually a processing centre in St Neots, where all the finds and all the soil samples came off site through all the different sites into here, processed and out the other end. And obviously trying to feed back the results to the team as quickly as we could. I think we got there in the end, but in the early days, I don't think we was quick enough getting the results out. All the data goes on to an Oracle database. We've got so many specialists. We're actually now in PostX. We've got so many specialists in different offices all around the UK that we have to share the information, so it's all in the cloud. So just to look at some of the challenges and some of the solutions. Picking up some of these issues right from the beginning, the travel trenching, right way through to resourcing, people, training, health and safety. So to start with trenching, we started back in August 2016 now. Typical story, put a tender out, don't hear much about it. Suddenly you get a phone call, and we had a 1 week lead in. That's quite typical. So that was all hard work, just getting the thing going. And also the current sort of era of infrastructure is prompting a lot of JVs to get together. A lot of clients, particularly HS2, Thames Tideway, I think, did the same thing. We're asking companies to consider forming joint ventures to deliver the scale of these projects. So we formed ours with Museum of London. We'd never worked together. This is the first job we ever did together. So there's lots of issues there about different companies have different job titles, different methodologies, different ways of doing things. The project was new to everybody, so health and safety was evolving as we went along. And then coming out of trail trenching, we went straight into mitigation. There was absolutely no gap. We literally were trenching on the Friday, straight into mitigation on the Monday. And the whole scheme started that way. Basically, everybody on day one in something like the first week in October, construction team as well as the archaeologists, the ecologists, everybody basically all started on the same day, and so we were all sharing a site. The client was also a new JV, so it was Costain, Skanska, Balfour Beatty and Carillion, with CH2M as the designers, and also Highways England. So they were a new JV in themselves, so they were finding their feet. And I suppose the first thing we realised, having come together and never worked together, is that we actually needed a new structure. So probably one of the first things we did was to develop our own MHI structure for doing projects like this, which had everything from supervisory board through to business support, commercial section, which is really where I sit. We had an innovation team that looked at training and innovation, and obviously delivering fieldwork and PostX. And what we found is that the roles and responsibilities we had on this project were actually quite different from our normal parent companies. So it's a new experience for everybody, and it's very, very easy for people to fall into their existing job description rather than the new role that they've got on a project like this. A client, as I mentioned before, actually there was 4 different clients building 4 different roads, so that was an issue in itself, and joining it all up was quite a struggle. They eventually brought in a Steve Sherlock, a consultant, to help that, and he did a great job in helping us work with them. There was no real program in those early days, only a 3-week look ahead. So again, very difficult to plan your resources when you really don't know what's happening other than 3 weeks ahead. Another issue we had was the priorities on the scheme. The enabling works were very keen to get haul roads in, piling platforms and compounds. And that often meant part excavating sites, not in their entirety, because if we'd done the whole site, we would have fallen behind. So we ended up having to do parts of sites quite often in those early months. And also as changing competing priorities, you had, was the priority the road line, or was it the haul roads, or was it the borrow pits, which are almost a bigger footprint as the road? or was it the utility diversion? So often competing priorities had us moving from one to the other. And really the client had never dealt with archaeology on this sort of scale. Often this sort of work is done before they get on. And so there was a real learning curve for them as well. Just another quick look at the scale and resourcing. We had about 30 on the child trenching. We then started mitigation with about 50, and then we were immediately required to scale up to 180, and then it became up to 300. So it was quite a push. There was a massive kind of recruitment drive. There were other big schemes going on at the same time as us. For example, East Anglia 1 was not far away. Northstowe, one of the big new garden towns similar to what Jenny was talking about. And Lincoln Bypass was going on at the same time. So there were a lot of contractors all recruiting all at the same time. And that actually did drive up wages, which is probably a good thing. Inductions, when you're trying to get that many people onto site quickly, inductions become a real issue, booking them in, organising them, finding drivers, making sure the supervisors all got the right health and safety tickets, triple STS tickets. As I say, for the communications, I just mentioned this at the bottom there, the project managers, we had actually 7 managers on the scheme at its peak. They're getting 100 emails a day, 30 to 40 phone calls a day, so you can see how busy they were. Some things we did to try and keep our resources up, so basically trying to recruit people but also retain them. So we had finder's fees for finding new staff. We had a loyalty bonus which the client backed us on, so if you stayed till the end you got a bonus rather than left early. We also brought in subcontractors, I mentioned earlier. Cotswold Oxford PCA helped us tremendously. They had about 100 people at its peak. And also to try and reduce the reliance on more and more, finding more and more archaeologists, we also had a couple of schemes going where we had recent graduates. We had 20 recent graduates we got onto the scheme. And also another scheme where we had 20 non-archaeologists, local people who were really career changers, and that was quite an exercise. So yeah, one of the issues you have with subcontractors, I think, is following a common methodologies, whether it's survey or whether it's admin, timesheets, and so you do have issues like that. We found it better when we had them all working together rather than putting a team from one company on a site. We found it much more successful if we mix all the people up together and they all work together. I think that was much more successful, although we did do both. To imagine there, and also even though they're subcontractors, they all joined our management team, and often they represented MHI at client meetings, so they were well integrated into our team, which I think is the only way to do it. As I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of competition from other infrastructure projects at the same time. Probably the biggest challenges, and it's not so much finding as many diggers as you need, and in fact we didn't have too much of a problem with that. It's actually often the supervisors and the more senior staff, because you need an army of supervisors, machine watchers, surveyors, etc., to run these schemes. So that was probably, and we ended up training something like 100 people in survey towards the end. Again, certificates, getting people trained. The construction industry has high standards and expects supervisors, if they're managing people in dangerous situations, to be fully trained. The other thing, that the point at the bottom here is quite a statistic. About 75% of our staff were actually foreign nationals, so a lot of them were Italian, Spanish and Portuguese. I mentioned this earlier, we created new roles on the scheme. We tried to get away from old job descriptions and old job titles, because actually they don't work. Every company has different titles, so we created a new set. We tried to balance the team, the new recruits with core staff, and buddying up with more experienced people. Trained so many people in survey. Basically everyone was trained on the project to survey. We did have a team of dedicated surveyors, but actually everyone was trained to survey. And we also had issues with some of the foreign workers, so we had mixed in some translators in amongst the teams. Health and safety is an interesting one. I think as an industry, we're very, very honest about health and safety. And every time we get a slip or a trip or a bee sting or a cut finger while troweling, we report it and fill it all in, and I don't think anyone else does it. And as a result, we end up with some horrendous statistics, but actually we were pretty safe, but it was a struggle. We used to get beaten up by our stats, by the contractor, but actually they did admit that we were doing the right thing. So we worked very hard to try and, particularly slips and trips, we spent a lot of time putting in safe walkways, things like EcoGrid. It was the wettest winter in about 10 years, which really didn't help. We also included physiotherapists. We had a lot of sort of muscle strains and stuff like that. So we, particularly in the cold winters, two winters we spent. So we brought in physios to try and look at the way we did things in terms of shoveling and pushing and lifting. And they came up with a series of stretching exercises, and we did manage to get the number of injuries down. We also had external health and safety consultants, which really helped us. So we didn't just use archaeologists trained to do a bit of health and safety, we had actually professionals with us. And we did a lot of training on incident reporting, particularly. And also the client was very helpful. They had full-time on-site occupational health service, so we used that, and we did a lot of training in mental health well-being. And obviously mentioned the physiotherapists we brought in. And we've taken that from here to other sites we've been working on. In terms of so what now, we finished the field work pretty much summer last year. We still come backwards and forwards. They occasionally run out of gravel. We have to go back, and some of the design wasn't quite ready when we were there. But actually, I think one of the main achievements of the project is we've actually handed in the assessment and the UPD. We handed it in about a month ago, 6 weeks early. And actually it was within months of finishing on site. So that was a major achievement. And we did that by starting very, very early. We processed all the finds and all the soil samples actually on site. And there was a slight lag at the end, but we pretty much finished when the fieldwork finished. And as a result, we managed to get on with the post-ex assessment very quickly. It's gone in. We even managed to do it while we had to predict in some ways, because some of the sites we hadn't started. But we forecast the costs on that basis, and it's pretty much been accurate. So actually, we are well ahead in terms of the post-ex, and hoping to get that signed off very shortly. This is what I just mentioned. The other thing I'll say, the industry standard is probably something like 40 to 50% of fieldwork costs is the cost of post-ex. We've actually managed to get that down to 25, which is a reasonable number. Some of the things we did on training and innovation, it sounds very old school actually, but actually we used labourers, old-fashioned labourers. When you're short of archaeologists, professional archaeologists, or struggling to find them as quickly as you need them, there's no point wasting their time pushing wheelbarrows. So we had 30 labourers on the site who basically put fences up, pushed wheelbarrows about. The client gave us also help, so they gave us van drivers, help with logistics, moving finds around from one end of the scheme to the other. We had a dedicated training team, so we had 4 full-time trainers. A lot of the diggers we had were quite inexperienced, so we spent a lot of time training them to get their rates of progress up. And I mentioned earlier we had a training program for graduates and also one for non-graduates, and some of those are still with us, so that was quite an achievement. Some other little things we did, if anyone had been on these big sites, signing in and out is a major part of it. That's how you get paid. We introduced a biometric sign-in, a fingerprinting sign-in, and we managed to program that so the timesheets went straight into a database and came straight out in the application. So there was no double handling of paper timesheets, then filling in a spreadsheet and then filling in an application for payment. So one went straight into the other. We also used Hilti asset tracking to track finds and soil samples as they came off site into the warehouse and out again. And also we got a SharePoint platform. We've got so many contractors working with us that sharing information is an issue. So everything is shared on SharePoint and also in Oracle. In terms of a bit on added value, I think the main one for us was probably the PR that they gave the project. All these schemes can be controversial, but actually the work we did gave them lots of great news stories. There was the woolly mammoths I mentioned. There was the first beer campaign where we think we found the first production of beer in the Iron Age. The Roman coin that was minted in Germany and 3 weeks later appeared in near Cambridge, and also some stuff about biggest dig. We managed to get on in the Guardian, BBC's One Show. We even got on Have I Got News for You, which is quite something. And the project also picked up an award at Covenant Archaeology earlier on this year. According to our comms team, we've got a great comms team. We're based in Molar in London. They reckon that we've attracted coverage that's hit almost 60 million people in the various blogs and news items we've had. So I think that's great news for the client. That's just some of them. The One Show, the Guardian, Mail Online. So yeah, some fantastic publicity for the client. Just to finish up on the benefits of early involvement, I suppose I've been involved in schemes that have done both actually. A lot of the time it's pre-construction we're in, so we're in and out before construction starts and no one ever sees us. In some ways that's we're more in control, I think, but you do have a lot of access issues. The land is often not owned by the developer or whether the client at that time, so it's done with the goodwill of the farmer. It can be quite tricky. But you are in control. I think that's the attraction of that. During construction, I think the issue there is you've got you're bumping up against a lot of other contractors, and so there's a lot more work goes into the program. There are benefits though. There's the shared supply chain. Our client was fantastic in helping us, and with everything from fencing to compounds to everything. So actually, there's benefits in both. In terms of my own thoughts, I think sometimes, the more you know about the site, the more cost certainty you've got, and more program certainty you've got. So I think sometimes we're in danger of not doing enough. And I think site investigations can be a little formulaic in terms of trenching. You see it so many times. The brief goes into a bill of quantities, and basically you've got to do exactly that, no more, no less. I think it probably needs to be more flexible. You need to do more where you need to know more, and you can probably do less where you don't need to know more. So I think there's something to do there. Something that we didn't actually have in that we weren't actually in the client's team. We were actually off to one side, and I think that was a mistake. We really should have been in the client's team. I think the archaeology was as big a risk to the program as anything else, and really we should have had at least a couple of managers in the client's team. And I think next time I'd hope they'd do that. And the other thing, the last thing went there, I've seen it on in terms of an early contractor involvement. I'm sort of a fan of that. I think they've done it on HS2 South. But yeah, I think it's worth bringing in a contractor early on when the design is not quite firmed up. And I think you can really help keep the thing moving whilst working out the design until you've got something that's actually ready to go out to the market. But I think early contractor involvement is a formal way of doing that, and I think it's worth looking at that in some of these big schemes. That is me.
Lovely. Yep. Thank you. Thanks very much, Phil. Okay, I'm just going to hand over now to Ed. Perfect. Okay.
Good. Okay. Thanks for handing over. So I'm going to be presenting a summary of the Medmary habitat creation project, which is an Environment Agency-driven project, which was written as a Syria case study by the Environment Agency. And I'm also going to take you through the Sturt Peninsula case study, which was written by Wessex Archaeology, but which is another Environment Agency habitat creation scheme. Just in advance of that, Environment Agency input to the Syria Archaeology and Construction project has been provided by Olivia Merritt. She sends her apologies today and has sent me in her place. It's her birthday, so hopefully she's sitting somewhere with a slice of chocolate cake or something. Just to take you through a little bit about the Environment Agency's approach to heritage. We actually have a national in-house team of archaeologists, heritage specialists who sit within a combined team of landscape and landscape architects and archaeologists. And our role as a team is to identify heritage risk and opportunity on Environment Agency construction and maintenance projects. we build some quite big structures, nothing quite as big as the previous project, but some quite big things in terms of national flood defences. But we also have duties, legal duties, to create habitat, and this is to compensate for habitat that's lost due to sea level rise, which I'll touch on in a moment. And the two projects I'm going to quickly take you through reflect that sort of work. The team represents the Environment Agency when we're working with local authority archaeologists and with Historic England. So we're part of the process in terms of ensuring that we come up with the right design, but that we also come up with a design that is going to get planning permission or consent or whatever it is that we might need to deliver the project. And we also set the scope for our archaeological consultants and contractors. So we're not, as a team, producing some of the heritage products like desk-based assessments and visualizations ourselves, but we're making sure that the people that are producing them for us are given the appropriate scope to answer the questions that we as an organisation need to answer. And we also deliver the Environment Agency's obligations regarding heritage under the Environment Act. And that means that we need to have regard for the historic environment in terms of everything that we do, and that's written into the Act. So it's quite a big stick to wave at our engineers if we ever need to do that. We're basically there just to make sure that we take the role of the intelligent client, and that as an organisation we understand the archaeological implications of the decisions that we're making, and hopefully are making the right decisions both for the natural and for the historic environment. My role is I manage the principal tier of that landscape and heritage team. So the first bit I'm going to talk to you about is the managed realignment scheme at Medmary. This was a project that took place between 2010 and 2013, and it involved the managed realignment of the coast at Medmary, which is immediately to the west of Selsey Bill, just to the south of Chichester. And the aim of this piece of work was to create some compensatory habitat to allow the coast to adapt for intertidal habitat, which is being lost due to coastal squeeze. Now, coastal squeeze is, if you imagine our sea levels are rising, and that means that the intertidal zone ideally is moving gradually inland as the sea levels rise. But in some locations, we've got hard coastal defences in place, and that means that as sea level rises, that intertidal strip where you get these wading birds and special habitat surviving, that gets squeezed by the hard defence and eventually lost. And so we've got a legal requirement to compensate that by creating new intertidal habitats. Both of the projects I'm going to talk to you about relate to compensating the effects of coastal squeeze. The first one, as I say, is Medmary, which you can see on that little movie that's rolling in the top there. That's the project we're talking about, and there's an aerial view of it in the bottom left corner. So the scheme was creating a landscape which would regularly flood due to the tide, and we commissioned a program of archaeological investigation to try and understand the impact of that work. We knew that we would have about 60 hectares of landscape which would be impacted by intrusive groundworks, and we would likely to require 2 years of construction to put this structure in place. We had a model for our expectation of the archaeology, which in this area, which was for later prehistoric and early historic occupation in a sort of a sparsely populated coastal strip. And talking to Steve Kemp, who is the Environment Agency archaeological lead on this piece of work, one of the key issues, which I'll talk about in a moment, is that our model was a little away from reality, which is why there are some important lessons which we need to learn from this particular piece of work. So it's as I say, a £30 million managed realignment project affecting 300 hectares of land. The archaeological spend was about £1.2 million in terms of archaeological assessment and mitigation. And the baseline information that we had suggested that, there was very little in the way of known archaeology in that location. We also had to deal with the fact that There was very poor weather conditions at the point when we were planning to do our archaeological investigation, and we had issues with landowner access, which meant that, again, some of the archaeological assessment work which we had planned couldn't take place because we couldn't gain access at the appropriate time. There were some known monuments which we were able to avoid. They were things which were already on the HCR. I think there were 2 Second World War German aircraft crash sites which we were able to influence the design to avoid, both as war graves and as complex archaeological deposits, which we were trying to avoid getting mixed up in. And I suppose there was an unexploded ordnance issue with those sites as well. We also made good use of local heritage volunteers in neighbouring communities who became involved in the long-term monitoring of the designed erosion of the coast around the created habitat scheme. It was a very complex project, and there were lots of issues in terms of more archaeology being encountered than we had picked up in the assessment phase because of the reasons I've just touched on above. And that meant that actually a large amount of close collaboration within the project team was really important, and that is one of the things which we do quite well, because we have quite closely integrated teams with the landscape architects and the archaeologists embedded within the project team, alongside the designers, our consultants, and the contractors. So, in terms of lessons we learned from the case study which I've just described, as I think I've mentioned, we discovered an unexpectedly large amount of archaeology on this scheme. We were encountering Bronze Age settlement deposits and cemetery area funerary deposits within the habitat creation location, which the closely integrated team allowed us to manage and to design around. Big take-home message from this one was that we learned that in locations where little development was taking place, a desk-based assessment alone is never going to be enough. And this is quite often the case on our coastal schemes. We're working in locations where there hasn't been previous archaeological work, because there is a very, very low development pressure in the immediate zone behind the beach in these sorts of landscapes. So you don't get fine clusters, you don't get known sites having been picked up in previous pieces of infrastructure work or excavation. I think had we been able to get onto site and carry out the trial trenching which we'd originally designed, we would have been in a better position to avoid encountering the level of archaeology that we encountered during construction. For example, if one of our recurring issues on our Environment Agency flood defence schemes and habitat creation schemes is that you end up having to win quite a lot of earth and spoil locally to make embankments and holding areas for water. So that involves creating very large borrow pits. So these are quite large open areas which you end up stripping maybe 2, 3, 4 metres of material from. So you can actually have quite a large impact on archaeological sites, given the open area that's involved. But quite often you can move these things around if you know where the archaeology is. And the problem with Medmary was that we didn't get the normal window that we would have expected to have to be able to make an informed decision about where those borrow pits should take place. I think on reflection, from my perspective, we probably should have challenged the confidence level in our baseline a bit more strongly, the model. It's a good example of the well-known saying that gaps in evidence aren't necessarily gaps in the heritage. So we were in a sort of a higher risk scenario than we probably should have been, and as an archaeological profession, we maybe should be a bit better at challenging more firmly in those situations where we know that we haven't got the evidence that we actually need. Another lesson that we learned from this one was that despite the majority of delays being caused by poor weather, heritage was often blamed by members of the project team for slowing the work down. I think, again, we often find that archaeology is a scapegoat for other problems on a scheme. And I think as a profession, again, we need to challenge this behaviour. We need to call this out. It's the sort of thing which prevents us from learning from mistakes in projects. And I think we should be better at challenging back when we see this taking place. Another one that came from this project, it's better for us to move forward with a known level of archaeological risk rather than spending large amounts of time and money trying to precisely define the heritage cost at the design stage. There's more detail around that issue in the text of the case study, but that was certainly something which came out of this project. Finally, for MEDMRI, all members of the project team need to understand the wider objectives of the project, including the engineering and heritage objectives. I think one of the problems we had here was that there was a lack of understanding within the wider project team of the implications of moving forward without sufficient heritage detail. At a similar time that MEDMRI was taking place, we were also running another habitat creation scheme at Steert Peninsula. Now, Steert is out on the Somerset Levels. It was one of the, again, similar size to MEDMRI, as one of the largest coastal management schemes to have been completed to date. And it's situated at the mouth of the River Parrett, where it joins the Severn Estuary, close to Bridgewater. And it's a landscape that's prone to flooding, but it has some very sensitive habitats contained within the peninsula, which is shown on this slide. And it also has people living in the landscape. And so we were looking at a project which again was compensating for coastal squeeze, so the loss of coastal habitat, but also trying to help manage flood risk, as the MEDMRI scheme was also. It was happening in partnership with the Bristol Port's expansion. So they again were impacting on coastal habitats, and we were trying to mitigate some of those losses by creating intertidal habitat on the peninsula. Team Van Ord was the principal contractor on this one for the Environment Agency, and we had Wessex Archaeology working as our archaeological contractor, who actually prepared the case study document for this piece of work. We identified some high-level impacts as part of the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment phase of this project. So there were going to be large-scale and deep excavations to create tidal creeks and lagoons. We were also going to have to build a flood embankment, and we were going to have to relocate some of there were some newts which needed to be moved because they were going to be impacted by the construction work, and we had to create new habitat for them. And there was also the wider loss of a piece of historic landscape in terms of the peninsula that was going to change quite completely. So this is an image here of the scheme before the works actually took place. So in terms of this project, this is a £21 million project in terms of construction, affecting about 400 hectares of land. And like MEDMRI, we had very minimal level of information about the archaeology in advance of the scheme. This was one which I was managing the heritage risk on, as representing the Environment Agency. We spent about £800,000 on archaeological assessments and mitigation, carrying out a detailed programme of archaeological assessments, which led to a much more detailed understanding of the history of the landscape in advance of the design and construction process. And it was much more driven by information about the historic environment than I think MEDMRI was. So we were able to really integrate the archaeological information into the detailed design of the option. And there's a couple of examples of that in a moment that I'll show you as we move through the slides. We also used the historic environment to lead our engagement with the local community. So it was quite a good way to gather interest from local residents about the work that the Environment Agency was doing, was to actually use the heritage work almost as a Trojan horse to bring people onto site and talk to them about the environmental work which we were actually taking place. So this is a similar image to the one which I've just shown you, and it shows you the completed scheme. So you can see the creek network which has been created through a breach in the seawall on the right-hand side, linking into the channel of the River Parrett, which is tidal. And then in the foreground, you can see those wet areas, which are some of the lagoons which we created to give a variety of habitat types. I think in that case for wading birds. Key lesson for us is that from the STEER project, there's real value in having a very detailed understanding of the environment that we were working in and the scale of the impact that we were going to have. For example, you need to know that if there are no reported archaeological sites in a location like this, it's quite likely to be because no development has taken place to expose them. And I think, as I mentioned, we had on the HCR, before this project took place, we had one sherd of Roman pottery for this entire landscape that you're looking at. Following the scheme, we had, I think we ended up with 2 Roman settlement areas. I think we had 3 noted medieval occupation complexes. We had a prehistoric hunter-gatherer encampment within the marsh. There was a Second World War listening station. There were quite a few, quite a high density of monuments which had not been identified, and it's solely because in that landscape there hadn't been the opportunities for them to be exposed until we carried out our work. So just in terms of the approach we took, we really pushed heritage integration within the heart of the project team from the outset, which involved having to ensure that we had an archaeological contractor with the capacity to bring together lots of services under one roof. And in that instance, we used Wessex Archaeology to carry out that work. And everyone on the project team understood that evidence, that the absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, and that, as I mentioned, we couldn't rely on the fact that the low level of archaeological baseline was a true reflection of what was happening on the ground. We invested heavily in non-intrusive investigation from the very beginning. So we did the normal program of map progression and documentary research. We used the Environment Agency's LiDAR data. So this is this digital terrain mapping carried out by an aircraft that gave us very detailed topography of the site. We integrated our archaeological team alongside the existing geotechnical team who were designing the creeks to make sure we recovered archaeological information from that and built up a very detailed geotechnical deposit model. And continued to test the hypothesis of the development of the peninsula throughout the assessment program, mapping known historic seawalls that we could see actually in the landscape, for example, so that we could see how the peninsula had been created and developed over time. I think for me, one of the key messages is not to be afraid of those difficult conversations that we might have to have with the project team in terms of spending money at the very beginning to gather this baseline information. I found that it's much better to have a difficult conversation at the beginning of a scheme when you're designing rather than having a difficult conversation at the very end when you're running out of money. So that was an important lesson for us. A good example of the sort of thing we were doing, this is a slide which shows the peninsula, and I don't know if you can see, but there are a series of parallel lines which are running. I think you can see 3 or 4 lines in parallel running the length across the peninsula. One of the problems we had was that as most of the site was under grassland, field walking wasn't possible, which was one of the techniques we had wanted to use to see if we could identify any artifact scatters, because geophysics can be unreliable in these sorts of landscapes. So we actually, rather than just not doing the field walking, we got the local farmer to plough our field walking transects. And I know there's a cost to this, but in the scheme of things, it can save you hundreds of thousands of pounds. So we just need to be quite proactive in terms of making sure that sort of thing happens. But that's us ploughing transects for field walking, and then we did geophysics, and we followed the normal trial trenching approach, which has been described previously, which led to open air excavation of the known sites. Really working to absolutely minimise observation during construction. All of our work tends to be designed around separating archaeological work from the construction process, because I think, as we all know, the most expensive archaeology is the archaeology that happens when all the plants that stand still. So we managed to completely avoid that situation. It's also safer if we've got great big pieces of plant moving around, creating these big channels. We don't really want soft archaeologists moving around between them. So by trying to do the archaeology separately from construction, you can get a better level of information from the work and reduce the risk of people being injured or worse. We also made sure that all phases of archaeological work were carefully defined within the construction programme for the scheme. as I've mentioned, we used community engagement in heritage as a way to explain to the residents the wider environmental benefits of the scheme and to bring local residents on board. And this really built a good level of community trust, and there was a clear contrast in the way that they talked to us and about us in contrast to some of the other large developments which were happening. I think there was a lot of work going on at Hinkley Point at the time, and the residents were weighing up our approach alongside Hinkley's and were saying quite positive things about us, which was good news. So we tried to take this approach on all of our projects now. Archaeology allows us to enhance the story of place for local residents, and it also allows us to give something back to local communities. Creating a better place is our corporate strapline, and archaeology is one of the really strong ways that we can actually do this. And it's allowed us to move to a situation where some of the Environment Agency project managers want heritage on their projects to allow them to bring in that local interaction with local communities. We've had some positive outputs from it. We've obviously got the main report from the fieldwork, but we also have a local leaflet. We've got information panels and a heritage trail. And I think even the local residents are planning to rebuild the remains of a post-medieval guardrobe toilet as part of the visitor centre complex which exists inside the site. So there's some really good local involvement. Wessex had some very specific lessons which they've captured as part of the case study report. They've flagged up that a rapid assessment of results and frequent on-site consultation with statutory partners resulted in a researched and cost-effective targeted programme of works, and it didn't affect the progress of the scheme. And through that approach and with the cooperative working relationships between themselves, Team Van Ord and the Environment Agency, they were flexible enough to be able to redesign parts of the project when sites were found. I think originally when we designed the breach location for the scheme to the point at which the creek network joined the River Parrett, that was in the same location as a known wreck sitting in the intertidal scheme zone, which was picked up as part of the best-based assessment. You could see it at low tide, the remains of the boat. And so we basically redesigned the breach and moved the breach away from the structure so that we didn't, although we identified its presence, we didn't then have to archaeologically excavate it. My takeaway lesson from both projects is about confidence, and I think we as archaeologists need to be confident in the delivery of our advice to project teams. And I think similarly, project teams need to feel confident that we're providing professional, technically informed advice designed to support a mutually successful project outcome. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ed. Right, I'm just going to invite you to submit any questions that you may have for any of today's presenters. Yep, now's the time. I'll just be quiet for a couple of minutes just to give everybody on the webinar a chance to send any questions that you may have. So if you do that now, if we don't have any, I'll be back online in a couple of minutes to shut down the webinar. But also just to quickly mention that the Syria case studies, SP170 Archaeology and Development case studies, are now available as a free download from the Syria website. If you go to the Syria bookshop, and you'll find it in free publications. The webinar today has also been recorded, and we'll circulate a recording once we've done a brief edit to all those attending, so you can rewatch if you so wish. Okay, and thank you very much. And quickly submit any questions now. If not, we'll close down the webinar in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, yeah, we've had a quick flurry of questions come in. The first one is for Jenny, and this is from Ben. It says, great looking project, Jenny, thanks for sharing. Has there been much discussion of how the open spaces which are retaining heritage value within this landscape are to be protected going forwards?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Ben. There has been discussion. both quite a lot of discussion and not very much, if that makes sense. So in terms of the preservation of the open space around the barrows, there's quite a keen drive to preserve that as effectively undisturbed green space. So the aim for certainly some of the barrow locations will be that the existing agricultural land will obviously greatly reduce in size but remain untouched, and that's also similar for the open space around the medieval settlement at Otterpool Manor. Slightly different approach for some of the less significant barrows, where they will be preserved in open space, but that open space is likely to be allotments, so there won't be development over the top of the barrow location, but we will be preserving by record excavating, and then there will be in the final scheme of things there will be allotments in that location. The villa itself is likely to be subject to some further excavation, so the detail of the public space in that location might well change. So yeah, kind of yes and no, I guess, is the answer to the question, if that's helpful.
Yep, and Ben's just said a quick follow-up question: any protection in local policy? Question mark.
Yes, Folkestone and Hythe Council do have a heritage strategy policy document which we're working to quite closely at the moment, because we're designing the archaeological mitigation strategy for the area. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the detail of that policy strategy because I'm not involved in the actual production of the document, so I don't know if it directly talks about the individual features on the Otterpool site, but it's certainly got Otterpool clearly in mind.
Okay, thank you. I've got quite a few questions for Russell, so I'm just going to unmute Russell and might unmute Abigail as well. So Abigail, I know you had a question for Russell.
Shall I just ask him instead of you reading it out then?
Yeah, go.
Okay. Hi, Russell. I was wondering about the publication for the A14. Are you going down the traditional monograph route, or have you thought about other ways of disseminating? And has the client really engaged with that?
We actually talked about the sort of outputs very early on, which is why we managed to get on with the assessment, the UPD, and basically handed it in before we left site. But we agreed. There is a monograph, as you'd expect, but actually there's a lot of other stuff. There's a GIS, there's schools books, packs, popular books, technical articles. There's all sorts of stuff.
Okay.
So yeah.
Great.
Okay. And I've got another question here for Russell. Russell, this is from Victoria Donnelly. Russell, I was interested to hear about having a physiotherapist looking at how archaeology gets done. Any tips?
Yeah, we brought in. We had it was a real issue. We had a lot of, working through 2 winters. We had a lot of pulled muscles and strained muscles and bad backs, and people are off, and they can become riddles. So yeah, we brought in a sports physio who looked at what we did. They spent a whole day with us, watching us shovel and pickaxe and pull buckets out of pits, etc. And they developed a series of sort of stretching exercises which we had to do each morning before we started work. And we've since adopted that and rolled it out on HS2 as well.
Okay, I think there's one final question, which is, Victoria says, fascinating, thank you. I have one more question, which I think is directed at Russell and Ed. Sorry if that isn't the case, but it says A14 and EA projects, how do you handle ownership of artefacts? And that was from Tim Malin.
Well, technically the landowners, I think the landowners were written to, and so they've got their agreement that fines go to the local museums. So I think that was all done by the client before we started.
Anything to add, Ed?
Similar for us, really. We try quite hard not to end up owning the sites at the end of them, because we're trying to avoid having a great big estate. I think most of them are, the sites are actually owned and maintained by, I think I think the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust run the Steert site. But yeah, we have landowner arrangements for deposition set up at the beginning of the project.
Yeah, perhaps I could just add that Tim's listening there. We had such a volume of material, tons and tons and tons of stuff. So we worked quite hard to agree a sampling policy and a discard policy, so we don't end up either putting it all in the salt mines in Cheshire or dumping it on the local museum. So we're working really hard to get that down, and it's allowed us to get the costs manageable as well.
Okay, Tim asks, whose responsibility is it to make the transfer of title?
That's a good point. Would that be I think the client's been dealing with that. I think Highways England have been dealing with that.
All right. If you have any other questions, speak now. If not, we will end the webinar. Okay. No, it doesn't look like anything else is coming in. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to today's presenters. For some really interesting, fascinating presentations, and clearly had some good feedback there from the people that have asked questions. Just a further reminder, the case studies document is available on the Syria Bookshop in the free publications area, and the webinar recording will be available in a few days. We will email you when it's available. And that's it. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and thank you to today's presenters. Thank you.